sold a lie. A lie that says every monster is just misunderstood. Every villain has some tragic backstory. From the children of Disney's villains becoming pop singing heroes to the way we frame right and wrong in politics, we, as a culture, have completely embraced the redeemable villain. But in doing so, have we forgotten what evil actually looks like? Let me convince you, dear viewer, that this isn't just about some movie trope. This is how an obsession with the misunderstood villain has raised a generation that is dangerously naive when faced with true evil. So let's examine how everything has gone wrong, and more importantly, what are some examples of villains done right?
The rise of the redeemable villain.
So how do we even get here? In order to understand that, we have to take a look at the stories we are telling our kids. Take Disney's franchise, The Descendants. The kids of villains like Maleficent and Jafar are brought from their island prison to the perfect kingdom of Auradon. They show up with a mission from their evil parents to steal the fairy godmother's wand. And of course, achieve world domination while they're at it. But naturally, this whole plot gets derailed pretty fast by the temptations of friendship, romance, and high school dance numbers.
Suit of armor strong and true, make this metal bust a move!
And by the end of the first movie, Mal, the daughter of the mistress of all evil, chooses to be good simply because it makes her happy. And the sequels just double down on that. I don't mean to get into spoilers, but you're not really being spoiled by anything. Good guys win in the end. You have Yuma, Ursula's daughter, finally getting her redemption arc, and in the newest one, Descendants, The Rise of Red, has the Queen of Hearts' daughter teaming up with Cinderella's kid to go back in time and undo the trauma that made her mom a villain in the first place. The message here is pretty clear. Evil isn't a choice, it's just a product of circumstance. It's a trauma that can be healed with just the right touch, with enough love. I'll give you another example. Again, Disney related. I'm sorry, Disney. It's your turn to get bashed today. We did Amazon with Rings of Power, so...
You're not special, you're just next.
The TV series Once Upon a Time builds its entire world on pretty much the same premise. Characters like the evil queen, Regina, or the deeply manipulative Rumpelstiltskin are given these huge, sympathetic backstories that try to reframe all the wicked things they do. Regina's reign of terror, which included mass murder, psychological torture, is eventually just traced back to losing a loved one. Rumpelstiltskin's centuries of dark dealings and manipulation are excused as a desperate attempt to find his son. And in the end, both get offered redemption, not because they face any real consequences, but because the heroes work so hard to see the good in them.
Don't make me destroy you.
I know there is good in you. The Emperor hasn't driven it from you.
The show pretty much waterboards you with the idea that no sin is too big to be washed away by a good ending. And don't get me wrong, these can make compelling, entertaining stories. I myself watched Once Upon a Time for almost all the seasons, except for the last one. It got kind of weird towards the end. But I have a level of discernment, and if people grow up being drowned in stories like these, then it can become a problem.
Moral clarity to moral confusion.
Now, this idea existed for decades, probably as a result of people becoming tired of the whole heroes are good and villains are bad black and white archetype. In fact, I could probably make an entire video just on that alone. But the trend really exploded after the musical Wicked reframed the Wicked Witch of the West from being, well, the Wicked Witch.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too.
To instead being a bullied activist fighting back against a corrupt system. And that marked a massive shift in our storytelling. For centuries, perhaps all of existence, our classic myths and fables treated evil very differently than what we see today. Think of the Faustian bargain from Goethe's Faust. Dr. Faust sells his soul to a demon for power or knowledge, but in the end, he's not redeemed. His pact is an irredeemable choice that leads him quite literally to hell. In the same way, classic Disney villains used to be forces to be reckoned with. Scar, the evil queen, Judge Frollo, they were all defined by an amount of unapologetic malice. And in the end, they were all punished, defeated, and often killed to reinforce a clear moral line between good and evil. Justice was supposed to win against an evil that chooses to be evil. And likewise, the viewer was supposed to fight against that evil and align themselves with good or righteousness. The modern sympathetic villain, unfortunately, rejects all of that. There's far less clarity, because instead of being an evil we're supposed to avoid, they become an object of our pity, or even someone to cheer for. Their backstory recontextualizes the evil that they do in the future and becomes their justification Because as I said before, if we just dig deep enough, we'll find some wound or some circumstance that just explains it away. But by always excusing the villain in fiction, we condition ourselves to also excuse it in reality. And in my opinion, it's not about just making stories more complex anymore. At this point, it's fundamentally changing our cultural understanding of morality and accountability. It's not a coincidence that the people producing our media can no longer create compelling narratives. Instead, they have to build off an existing franchise and spin those into a billion different sequels, prequels, and sideshows, literal sideshows. It's not just because it's difficult to get funding for good ideas in Hollywood. That's definitely a huge factor. It's really because many of our writers and our culture as a whole has become infantilized as a result of the misunderstood villain.
Real world consequences. We can't have you forgetting about those.
This constant diet of redeemable villains has consequences that go far beyond just our television and our books. It cultivates a dangerous naivety, especially in a generation that grew up seeing every monster as just a misunderstood soul. So when our main cultural story teaches that evil is just a pain that hasn't been heard, we start to lose our ability to recognize and confront evil that acts by choice. And even worse than that, it gives us cartoonish ideas of what evil actually is. Take The Force Awakens, for example. One of the villains is the military leader of the First Order. Who comes up with these childish names? General Hux. And he's shown as this silly-sounding man, screaming at a throng of stormtroopers in a scene with overtly Nazi comparisons. And later on, he gets completely dehumanized on screen. They made you look even more incompetent and useless for laughs. Because evil's incompetent, right, guys? Evil's incompetent. That's why evil loses. What a great story. But yes, I get it. That's just one guy from what I think is a horrible film that I also refuse to review, although it's probably better than Rings of Power. But you have to understand the implications. Our modern media will simultaneously teach you that villains are redeemable and misunderstood, but on the off chance that you get a real villain, then he'll lose because he's incompetent or messed up in some really obvious way, and just didn't happen to consider that the hero might use the power of friendship and cooperation to just blow away all their plans. Who would have thought of that? Now think, what effect would this have on people who grew up on this diet? And what is it doing to young adults right now? Because this mindset is bleeding directly into our social and political discourse. We already see a reluctance to hold malicious figures accountable. And instead, there's this endless search for some kind of sympathetic motive. There has to be a reason that people are evil.
Let's see. Take responsibility for my own life or blame you. Ding, 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 ding. Blame you wins hands down.
We have to analyze the difficult childhoods of dictators or the societal pressures on corrupt leaders as an excuse for the evil that they do. Just like in Once Upon a Time, we start to believe that our empathy is some kind of superpower that can redeem anyone. And unfortunately, we start to prioritize the need to understand over the need to judge. We don't want to just believe that people can simply be evil, because for many people, it's a frightening place to be to even consider what would they do if evil couldn't be reasoned with. Obviously, such a person that couldn't possibly be reasoned with had to be defective in some way. Something has to be wrong with them. If we can't empathize our way into understanding them, if we can't find that trauma in their backstory to realize why they're evil or why they think differently than us, then they must be defective. They must be broken. They must be mentally ill. I mean, that's what our media has taught us. And when it comes to justice, well, the misunderstood villain trope aligns perfectly with an ideology that frames criminal behavior as a product of societal failure, instead of a result of individual choices. Now look, social conditions are a factor. Yes, don't get me wrong. But when you take this idea to its extreme, you completely remove personal agency from the equation. Real life criminals often do have tragic backstories, but unlike in the movies, those backstories does not absolve them of their wrongdoing. They're still responsible for what they steal, who they kill, who they harm. But a generation has been raised on stories where the villain kids from the Isle of the Lost are reformed after one semester in a nice school might be more inclined to believe that simple changes in the environment are enough to solve evil. Instead, they'll be ready to take conflicts and boil them down into some simplistic oppressed versus oppressor narrative where somehow the people who are oppressed magically have no agency. After all, it's not their fault they're making bad choices. They're just reacting to the oppressor. Do you see how this is a problem? Evil people are not victims. Evil people are authors of their own evil.
Look, I'm sorry your life turned out so bad, but don't blame me. You messed it up yourself.
Doesn't matter what their backstory is. Doesn't matter if you sympathize or empathize with their backstory or where they came from. At some point, that young person became an adult, and they became responsible for the decisions that they made. They made a conscious choice to get to where they are now, despite their upbringing. Now, the classical stories, they understood this. We might look at them as simpler simply because they're, well, older, but that's not exactly accurate. You see, the young man understood a call to adventure because of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the call to duty with the King Arthur series. Young women nowadays might actually have the answer to the question, why not make an OnlyFans if our culture still normalizes the story of the Faustian bargain? The idea that a deal with the devil will only bring about ruin to yourself and those around you, and that the riches and the loss of integrity aren't worth it as you're dragged into hell. By replacing these tales, these stories which preserve morals that people learned over generations, over hundreds and thousands of years, by replacing them with fantasies that simply entertain and avoid any relevant moral questions, we have raised generations that are fundamentally unprepared to face them.
Shut up! And don't call me Goob! How many evil villains do you know who can pull off a name like Goob? Bleh.
Reclaim the unapologetic villain.
We need stories that are brave enough to show evil, not to glorify it, but to teach us how to recognize it. And a truly great villain honestly doesn't need a backstory. We don't need to know all about them. Such a villain needs to only have one of these three traits: cruelty, cunning, or greed. Cruelty. This isn't just anger or violence without purpose. Cruelty is often the deliberate, even gleeful infliction of suffering. It is malice for its own sake. A cruel villain teaches us a vital lesson. Some forces in the world are purely destructive, and you cannot reason with them. They must be fought at all costs. The perfect embodiment of this is Sauron from The Lord of the Rings. We're given no sympathetic backstory for Sauron. We don't even know if he had a difficult childhood in Mordor. Ooh, it doesn't matter. He is a being of pure malice, a will bent on domination. He was the chief lieutenant of Morgoth, a demigod who was bent on corrupting all of Middle-earth out of pure hatred for all that Eru had created. Sauron isn't there to have the reader analyze his deeper pain. Sauron Rings of Power. That was stupid. It is the essence of Sauron to deceive and bring pain to as many people as possible. He is a primal force of destruction and evil, seeking to drag down as many as possible in rebellion against God. By presenting Sauron as an irredeemable force, the author of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, is telling us that this kind of evil exists, and the only proper response is to stand against it at the risk of losing everything and everyone you love. Cunning. A cunning villain is a master of manipulation, strategy, and deceit. They represent a more insidious evil, one that works inside systems and turns people against each other. Aizen from the anime Bleach is a prime example. For years, he pretends to be a kind, respected captain, while secretly orchestrating a centuries-long plan to overthrow Soul Society. What makes Aizen such a powerful villain is that he will say just the right things and paint the perfect picture to weave his way into your heart and mind, and then cut you down with a smile. And when he's defeated, he doesn't apologize. He's not sorrowful. He knows no one is capable of killing him. And even if they could, he's like an evil Batman. He has infinite prep time and infinite contingency plans for every possible scenario. So even when you think you've won, you're still just falling into a different plan, a different scenario that he already has mapped out ahead of time. He's smarter and quicker than you, and the only thing that could possibly be a surprise to him is for you to outsmart him. But let's be real, that's not going to happen very often. A cunning villain, like Aizen, teaches us to be wary of charisma without character, and it shows us that evil can be intelligent, patient, suave, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness. Even if you hate a villain like Aizen, you have to respect his cunning. And then there is greed, an insatiable, all-consuming desire for more. A good example of greed is one of the best, most refreshing villains we've had in years, Big Jack Horner from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. When you see his backstory, you realize he had a perfectly fine childhood with loving parents. Nothing was wrong. There was no trauma. He just is evil because he chooses to be. That's it. He's not misunderstood, and he's very clear in what he wants. He wants all the magic in the world for himself. Pretty simple. Not everyone who does bad things is a victim, and if you were to try to spend more time trying to reform or save Jack, or give him a happy ending like from Once Upon a Time where everyone deserves their good ending, he would simply use that time to hurt more people. Because again, some people are just that selfish, and there's nothing you can do about it. So a greedy villain like Jack Horner teaches us that you cannot appeal to the better nature of someone who doesn't have one.
You're horrible.
You're an irredeemable monster! Oh, what took you so long, idiot?
Cruelty, cunning, and greed. In my opinion, these traits create villains who actually serve a purpose. They are both a primal plot device and an impetus for the hero to be challenged and for the audience to be taught that real evil does exist. And unfortunately, it's a conscious choice. Sometimes the only way to deal with these monsters is to treat them like monsters. Now, don't get me wrong. This isn't to say that complex villains like Zuko or Magneto don't have their place. They do. In fact, those are very compelling characters that have multiple arcs, both good and bad. Zuko starts off as a oppressed teenager and ends up being one of the heroes towards the end. Magneto starts off being kind of good and then turns bad and then flops back and forth depending on what's going on. But when we make them the only kind of villain that's allowed in our stories, we lose our ability to recognize a true predator who doesn't need us to fix him.
I saved your life! You didn't save my life, you ruined my death!
So tell me, who is your favorite unapologetic evil villain? Has the misunderstood trope made us too soft in the real world? Or is my diatribe just a 17-minute boomer post? Now, I normally do more express cultural and some political content, but after a positive response to my last video comparing Freeman to Rings of Power, I decided to try my hands at media critique a second time. I love the feedback. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this and want to see more of it. And well, I'll see you again next time. Bye!